Dean told black PhD student her thesis was too ambitious. 3 universities offered her a chair that afternoon. I'm going to be honest with you, because I think honesty is what you need right now, even if it's not what you want to hear. This thesis, and I have read it, I want you to know I have read it, this thesis is too ambitious. It overreaches. It attempts to do what a team of senior researchers with decades of combined experience would struggle to accomplish, and you are proposing to do it alone, in 4 years, as a doctoral candidate. I'm not saying your ideas aren't interesting. I'm saying they aren't feasible, and I think you know that, on some level, if you're being honest with yourself. That was Dr. Elliot Marsh, Dean of the Graduate School of Social Sciences at Whitmore University, one of the most selective research institutions in the northeastern United States. He had been in academic administration for 19 years. He had a wall of credentials behind his desk, arranged with the care of someone who wanted visitors to understand, before they said a single word, exactly who they were talking to. He had delivered variations of this particular speech, in this particular office, with this particular tone of concerned but firm authority, more times than he could accurately count. He was delivering it now to a 28-year-old woman named Adaize Okonkwo, who was sitting in the chair across from his desk, with her hands folded in her lap and her thesis proposal open on the desk between them. And he had the settled confidence of someone who had never once been wrong about these things. He was wrong about this one. Because what Dr. Elliot Marsh did not know, what he had not bothered to learn, because learning it would have required asking rather than assuming, was that Adaize Okonkwo's thesis proposal had already been read by 4 people outside of Whitmore University. 4 people who sat on faculty review committees and chaired departments and made the kind of decisions that shaped the direction of entire academic fields. And all 4 of them, independently, had reached a conclusion that was the precise opposite of Dr. Marsh's. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Adaize Okonkwo would have 3 formal offers of an endowed chair on her desk. She was still a doctoral candidate. She had not yet defended. And 3 universities were about to tell her they wanted to build a department around her. Dr. Marsh had approximately 4 hours before he understood the magnitude of what he had just said in this office and to whom he had said it. Yo, before we go anywhere, I need you to sit with that for a second. This man looked at work that 3 universities were about to compete over, and his professional assessment was that it overreached, that the woman who wrote it needed to be honest with herself. I want you to hold that as we go through this story, because everything that follows is a direct consequence of that one meeting and the assumption underneath it. Let's get into it. Adaize Okonkwo was born in Lagos, Nigeria in 1995, the second of 4 children, and she grew up in a house where the expectation was not that you would try hard, but that you would understand what you were doing and why, because her father, Dr. Emeka Okonkwo, believed that effort without comprehension was just noise, and he had very little patience for noise. Emeka was an economist. He had studied at the University of Lagos and completed a fellowship at the London School of Economics and returned to Nigeria because he believed, and continued to believe against considerable evidence to the contrary, that the most important work happened where the most important problems were, and the problems he cared about were in Lagos. He worked for 20 years in applied economic research, studying informal labor markets and urban migration patterns, and the financial systems that developed outside the formal banking sector, when formal banking excluded too many people. He published in serious journals. He was invited to present at serious conferences. He was, within his field, a person of genuine standing whose work was cited by other people of genuine standing. He was also, at home, the kind of father who asked his children at dinner not what they had done that day but what they had thought about, and who expected the answer to be specific. Adaize had been specific since she was 6 years old. She had her father's quality of attention, the kind that did not wander, that stayed with a question until the question gave up something real. She had her mother's quality of patience. Ngozi Okonkwo was a secondary school literature teacher who believed that the most important things could not be rushed, and who had the temperament to live by this belief in a house with 4 children, which was not a small achievement. Adaize read everything. Not because she was told to, but because books were the fastest way to get to the next question, and she was always trying to get to the next question. She read her father's economics papers before she was old enough to understand them fully, and asked him questions about the parts she did not understand, and he answered them, seriously, the way he would answer a colleague, because he said there was no such thing as a question that didn't deserve a real answer. She finished secondary school at the top of her class and received a scholarship to study economics and sociology at the University of Ibadan. She completed her undergraduate degree in 3.5 years. 36, 528 and 15. She wrote her final thesis on mobile money adoption patterns in low-income urban communities across 3 West African cities, and her supervisor described it, in the evaluation letter, as the most sophisticated undergraduate research he had encountered in 22 years of teaching. She applied for graduate programs in the United States. She was admitted to 6. She chose Whitmore because of its research infrastructure, its access to longitudinal data sets, and because a professor named Dr. Claudia Ferrante was there, whose work on informal financial systems and economic exclusion was the work Adaiz considered the most important in her field and who had agreed, before Adaiz even arrived on campus, to serve as her primary advisor. Adaiz arrived at Whitmore on a Tuesday in late August, 6 years ago. She had one large suitcase and a carry-on, and a laptop bag and a folder of printed research papers she had been reading on the plane, and a certainty about what she was there to do that was not arrogance but something quieter and more durable than arrogance. It was the certainty of someone who had been building towards something for a long time and knew what the building was for. She started her doctoral work the following Monday. The thesis Adeze had spent 4 years developing was titled Financial Cartography of the Excluded, Mapping Informal Economic Infrastructure across Sub-Saharan Africa and the Urban American South. It was not a conventional doctoral thesis. It was not trying to be. The central argument was this, that the informal financial systems that developed in communities systematically excluded from formal banking, the rotating savings groups, the informal credit networks, the mobile money ecosystems, the community lending circles were not, as mainstream economic literature had long characterized them, evidence of financial primitivism or temporary workarounds. They were evidence of sophisticated financial architecture, built by people who had understood what formal systems would not provide, and had engineered alternatives that were, in many respects, more adaptive and more resilient than their formal counterparts. This was not a new observation. Scholars had been making versions of it for decades. What was new in Adaiz's work was the methodology. She had spent 3 years building a comparative analytical framework that mapped these informal systems across 14 communities, 7 in sub-Saharan Africa, 7 in the urban American South, using a combination of ethnographic fieldwork, longitudinal transaction data obtained through partnerships with 3 mobile payment platforms, and a network analysis model she had developed herself to identify structural parallels that qualitative analysis alone would miss. The scale of the data was unprecedented for a single researcher. The methodological integration of qualitative and quantitative approaches was ambitious in the way that genuinely new work is always ambitious. It did not fit neatly into the existing categories, which was precisely because it was proposing a new one. Dr. Claudia Ferrante, who had been Adaiz's advisor for 4 years and who had watched the thesis develop from a 20-page concept paper to a 460-page document with 47 pages of appendices, described it in her own words, in the advisor's letter she had written 3 months ago, as the most consequential doctoral thesis she had supervised in 31 years of academic life. Dr. Ferrante had also, without telling Adaiz, shared the thesis with 4 colleagues outside of Whitmore. She had done this not informally but through the proper scholarly channels as an anonymized working paper circulated for comment among a small group of senior researchers in the field. She had done it because she believed the work was significant enough to require external validation before the defense, and because she had learned, in 31 years, that the most important work was also sometimes the most misunderstood work, and she wanted the record to be clear before anything happened to complicate it. The 4 colleagues had responded. Individually and without coordination, they had reached the same conclusion. The thesis was not too ambitious. The thesis was exactly as ambitious as it needed to be to say what it was saying, and what it was saying was important. 3 of those 4 colleagues held chairs at universities with the resources to act on that conclusion. They had been planning to attend Adaise's doctoral conference presentation, scheduled for that afternoon at 3 o'clock, which Adaise did not yet know had become something rather more significant than a routine doctoral student presentation. She did not know any of this when she walked into Dr. Marsh's office at 10 o'clock that morning. She had not requested the meeting. It had been scheduled by the dean's office, through the graduate program coordinator, with a subject line that said only, Thesis Review Follow-Up. Adaise had assumed it was an administrative matter, a form to sign, a timeline to confirm, something procedural. She had arrived 3 minutes early, as she arrived for everything, and had sat down in the chair across the dean's desk with her thesis proposal in her bag, and no particular sense of what was coming. Dr. Marsh had opened the conversation with a compliment about her undergraduate record and her early coursework at Whitmore. He had said that she was clearly a talented researcher. He had used the word talented twice, which Adaise noted, because talented was the word people used when they were about to say but. Then, he had opened the thesis proposal, not her 460-page full document, but the 40-page summary proposal she had submitted to the graduate committee 6 weeks ago, and he had placed it on the desk between them as if it were evidence of something. He told her the committee had reviewed it. He said there were concerns. He said the scope was, frankly, beyond what a single doctoral candidate could manage with credibility. He said the data integration model she was proposing was methodologically complex in ways that had not been fully worked out in the literature, and that attempting to pioneer a new methodology at the doctoral level, while admirable in ambition, was likely to produce a dissertation that was broad but thin, that covered a great deal of ground without going deep enough into any of it to constitute a genuine scholarly contribution. He said she should consider narrowing. He suggested she select 2 of the 14 communities and build a more focused comparative case study. He said this was not a diminishment of her work, but a refinement of it. He said the best theses were disciplined theses. He said he had seen many talented students. He used the word again, overextend themselves and spend an extra 2 or 3 years in a program because they had refused to listen to experienced guidance about the realistic scope of doctoral work. He said he was telling her all of this because he wanted her to succeed. Adaise listened to all of it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and she listened the way her father had taught her to listen, not waiting for her turn to speak but actually processing what was being said, assessing it, filing it. She asked one question when he finished. She asked which members of the graduate committee had reviewed the proposal. Dr. Marsh said the committee had reviewed it collectively and that individual deliberations were confidential. She asked whether Dr. Ferrante had been part of the review. There was a pause. A brief one, but a specific one. Dr. Marsh said that the committee's composition was a matter for the committee and that Dr. Ferrante's role as her advisor meant her perspective was already well represented in the process. Adaise understood from this, with precision, that Dr. Ferrante had not been consulted. She looked at Dr. Marsh for a moment, met her gaze with the benign confidence of someone delivering news they believed was both unwelcome and necessary. She looked at the thesis proposal on his desk between them 40 pages, representing 4 years of work she understood completely, and he had summarized in 20 minutes. She said, "Thank you for your time, Dr. Marsh. I'll take your feedback under consideration." She picked up her bag. She stood. She thanked him again. She walked out of his office and down the corridor of the graduate administration building and out through the glass doors into the October air, which was cold enough that she could see her breath. She stood outside for a moment. She looked at the quad, at the students crossing it with their bags and their coffee cups and their particular quality of motion, the motion of people moving between one thing and the next with the assumption that the next thing would be there. Then she called Dr. Ferrante. "Okay, I have to stop here, because I want you to understand what just happened in that office and what didn't happen." Adaise Okonkwo sat across from a man who told her that the most important work of her academic life was too ambitious, and she did not defend it. She did not argue. She did not produce her data or her methodology or the 460 pages that represented 3 years of fieldwork across 2 continents. She said thank you, and she left. And, I know some of you are thinking, why didn't she fight back? But stay with me. Because what she did next, and what was already in motion before she even walked into that office, is about to become very clear. Keep watching. Dr. Claudia Ferrante answered on the second ring. She was in her office, which was where she was most mornings, because Claudia Ferrante was a woman who had been in the same office for 26 years and had no particular intention of being anywhere else. Adese told her about the meeting. She did it in the precise and unemotional way she described things, the facts in their order, the language used, the specific points raised. She described the suggestion to narrow to two communities. She described the word ambitious used as a warning. She described the word talented used as a preface to a but. She described Dr. Marsh's confidence, which had been complete and untroubled throughout. Dr. Ferrante listened. When Adese finished, Dr. Ferrante was quiet for a moment that Adese recognized, from 4 years of working with her, as the silence of someone deciding exactly what to say. Then Dr. Ferrante said, I need to tell you something that I should probably have told you earlier, and I apologize for the timing. 3 months ago, I shared an anonymized version of your thesis with 4 colleagues. I did this through proper scholarly channels, as a working paper circulated for comment. I did it because I believed your work deserved external evaluation at this stage, and because I wanted to be certain that my assessment of it was not distorted by the closeness of the advising relationship. Adese was quiet. Dr. Ferrante said, I received responses from all 4. I will read you one of them. From Professor James Osei Bonsu at Columbia, whom you may know by reputation. She paused. There was the sound of paper being handled. Then she read. The work represented a methodological intervention of genuine significance. The data integration framework was original. The comparative architecture was defensible and rigorous. And the scope, rather than being a weakness, was precisely what gave the argument its force, because the argument required the scale to establish the structural parallels it was claiming. He had described it, further on, as the kind of work that appeared once in a cohort and that departments organized themselves around. Adese sat down on a bench on the quad because her legs had decided this was necessary. Dr. Ferrante said, the other 3 responses were variations on the same conclusion. All 4 of them are attending your presentation this afternoon. 2 of them have asked me about your plans post-defense. One of them, and I want you to hear this clearly, one of them has already spoken to his provost. Adese said, Claudia. Dr. Ferrante said, I know. Adese said, how long have you known? Dr. Ferrante said, 3 months. I wanted to wait until after the defense to tell you, because I did not want it to alter your relationship to the work. The work needed to be what it was for you, not what it was for anyone else. But given what you've just told me about Marcia's meeting, I think you need to know what's in motion. A pause. How are you? Adese looked at the quad. At the students crossing it. At the October sky, which was the color of something that was about to change. I'm fine, she said. Which was true in the way that fine is true when what you mean is that you are processing several things simultaneously and you are choosing to stay upright while you do it. Doctor, Ferrante said, come to my office. We are going over the presentation together, and then we are going to your defense, and we are going to do it the way the work deserves. Adese said she would be there in 10 minutes. She stood up from the bench. She straightened the strap of her bag on her shoulder. She walked back across the quad toward the humanities building, and if anyone had been watching her, they would not have been able to identify, from the way she moved, whether she had just had the worst morning of her academic life or the best, because she walked the same way she always walked, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who knew where she was going and had built enough margin into the day to get there without rushing. She spent 2 hours in Dr. Ferrante's office. They went through the presentation section by section, not because Adese needed to review the material, she knew the material the way she knew her own name, in the bone, but because Dr. Ferrante believed that the ritual of preparation was itself a form of respect for the work, and because Adese had learned, in 4 years, to trust Dr. Ferrante's instincts about what a moment required. Dr. Ferrante told her, over coffee, who the 4 external reviewers were. She told her their affiliations. She told her which two had asked about her post-defense plans. She did not tell her about the one who had spoken to his provost, because that was the piece of information she wanted Adeze to receive in the room, not in advance. She told her what she thought would happen that afternoon, and she told her to be present for it without trying to manage it. Adeze said she was not sure she knew how to do that. Dr. Ferrante said that was fine, and that she did not need to, and that the work would do the managing, and that her job was simply to be in the room with it. They walked to the conference hall together at 2:45. The conference hall was in the main academic building, 3 floors up, with tall windows that looked east over the campus and caught the afternoon light in a way that made the room feel larger than it was. It seated 120 people. It was used for faculty colloquia and distinguished lectures and, 4 times a year, for the doctoral student presentation series that was theoretically a routine academic event and that had never, in the memory of anyone who worked in the graduate school, looked like what it looked like that afternoon. There were 114 people in the room when Adeze walked in. This was not typical. Doctoral student presentations in the social sciences at Whitmore usually drew 20 to 30 people, committee members, fellow students, a few faculty who followed the area. 114 people was a number that belonged to distinguished lectures. It was a number that meant something had circulated. That word had moved through the right channels, and the people in those channels had come. Adeze saw the room, and for approximately 3 seconds, she stopped walking. Dr. Ferrante, half a step behind her, put a hand briefly on her elbow. The work brought them, Dr. Ferrante said quietly. Walk to the front. Adeze walked to the front. She recognized Dr. Osei Bonsu from his faculty photograph. He was in the 3rd row. A tall man in a gray suit with the alert expression of someone who had read the material and was here to watch it move. She did not recognize the others she would later be introduced to, but she felt their attention differently from the ambient attention of the room. There was a quality of specific focus that she had learned to recognize, from years in academic spaces, as the attention of people who had already decided that what they were about to see mattered and were here to confirm it. She set up her laptop. She arranged her notes. She stood at the lectern and looked at 114 people looking back at her, and she thought, briefly and clearly, about her father asking her at the dinner table not what she had done but what she had thought about, and she thought about what she had thought about for the last 4 years, and she began. She spoke for 62 minutes, 12 minutes over the standard slot, which the session chair allowed without interruption because the room had achieved the particular quality of silence that indicated no one wanted it broken. She laid out the methodology first, the network analysis model, the data integration framework, the rationale for the 14 community scope. She showed the structural parallels the framework had surfaced, the patterns that appeared across 7 African cities and 7 American ones, the evidence that what mainstream economic literature had called informality was in fact architecture, designed and refined by communities with a complete understanding of what they were building and why. She showed 3 case studies in depth: Kano, Nigeria; Mobile, Alabama; Nairobi, Kenya. She showed how the rotating savings group in Kano and the lending circle in Mobile shared structural features that the standard models of informal finance had no framework to describe, and how her model described them, and what that description revealed about the nature of financial exclusion as a design problem rather than a cultural one. She showed what happened when these systems were integrated with mobile payment infrastructure. She showed 3 years of longitudinal transaction data, rendered in visualizations she had built herself, that demonstrated adaptation curves no one had previously mapped. She said, in the concluding section, that the implications of the framework extended beyond academic description, that if informal financial systems were architecture rather than improvisation, then the appropriate response to financial exclusion was not to extend formal systems downward into excluded communities, but to study what excluded communities had already built and ask what formal systems could learn from it. That the policy conversation had been running in the wrong direction for 40 years, and that the data suggested a different direction was not only possible but already partially realized in the communities she had studied. The room was quiet when she finished. Then Dr. Osei Bonsu started the applause and the room followed him. The question period lasted 45 minutes. The questions were not the gentle questions of a routine doctoral presentation. They were the serious questions of senior researchers who had read the work and wanted to test its limits and found, each time they pressed, that the limits were further out than they had expected. Ades answered everyone. Not defensively, not with the hedged language of a candidate protecting a position, with the fluency of someone who had been inside the work long enough to see it from every angle and knew which angles were load-bearing and which ones were not. At 4:37, as the formal session was concluding and people were beginning to stand and move toward the front, a woman Ades did not yet know made her way through the room with the purposeful movement of someone who had somewhere specific to be. She introduced herself. Her name was Professor Amara Diallo. She held the Senghor Chair in Development Economics at Princeton. She had been one of the 4 external reviewers. She said, "I have a formal offer letter in my bag. I was going to present it through proper channels after your defense, but given that I've now watched the defense, I don't think I want to wait." She said Princeton was offering Ades an endowed assistant professorship in the Department of Economics and Public Affairs, with a research budget and a mandate to build the research program she had described in her thesis. She said the appointment could be held pending the official conferral of the degree. She said Princeton did not do this often. She said Princeton was doing it now because the work merited it. Ades stood very still. Professor Diallo handed her a sealed envelope. Before Ades could fully process what was in her hand, Dr. Osei Bonsu appeared at her left. He said Columbia's Department of International and Public Affairs had authorized him to make a formal offer of an endowed chair at the associate level accelerated, given the scope of the work, to associate rather than assistant. He said Columbia's Urban and Social Policy Center had already discussed building a research cluster around her framework. He said he had the letter on his phone and would have the formal documentation delivered to Dr. Ferrante's office by end of day. Ades looked at Dr. Ferrante, who was standing 4 feet away watching this with an expression of complete composure that Ades recognized from 4 years of reading that face as composure being maintained over something else entirely. The third offer came 12 minutes later from Professor Daniel Ibarra of the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, who had been the 4th external reviewer and who had driven 4 hours that morning from a conference in Philadelphia specifically to be in the room. He said Chicago was prepared to offer her a named chair which meant an endowed chair with a donor designation, which meant a level of institutional investment that was extended to a very small number of scholars in informal economic systems and policy. He said the offer included a research-centered directorship. He said Chicago had approved this at the provost level. He said they wanted an answer before another institution got one. Ades was holding 3 sealed envelopes. She was 28 years old. She had not yet defended. She was, by every formal designation, still available to the graduate school at Whitmore University, a doctoral candidate. She was also, as of 4:51 that afternoon, someone that Princeton, Columbia, and the University of Chicago had decided they wanted to build around. She found an empty classroom down the hall from the conference room. She sat down in a chair. She put the 3 envelopes on the desk in front of her, and she looked at them for a long moment. Then she called her father. He answered on the 3rd ring. It was late evening in Lagos. She could hear, behind his voice, the sound of the television that was always on. She told him what had happened. Not the morning she would tell him about Dr. Marsh later, when she had more distance on it, but the afternoon, the room, the questions, the 3 envelopes on the desk in front of her. Her father was quiet for a moment after she finished. A long moment. The kind that in another person might have meant they were searching for words, but that in Emeka Okonkwo meant he was feeling something fully before he said anything about it. Then he said, "Tell me about the work." "Not the offers. The work. What did you show them?" And Ades Okonkwo, sitting in an empty classroom at Whitmore University with 3 chair offers on the desk in front of her, and 4 years of the most serious work of her life finally visible to the people who could see it, told her father about the work. She described the network analysis model. She described the 14 communities and what the data had shown across them. She described the structural parallels. She described the case studies. She described the moment in the presentation when she had explained that the policy conversation had been running in the wrong direction for 40 years, and the room had gone quiet, in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said clearly. Her father listened. She could feel him listening the way she had always been able to feel it. The quality of attention that had shaped her own quality of attention, passed down through years of dinner table questions and serious answers. When she finished, he said, "The work is right. Not the offers, not the chairs, not the universities. The work." She said, "Yes." He said, "Then the rest will arrange itself." She said, "It seems to be doing that." He made a sound she recognized as the sound he made when he was smiling. "Go eat something," he said. "You think better when you're not hungry." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and she let it surprise her. She said she would call her mother next. He said her mother already knew, because her mother always knew, which was a claim Hades had been testing her whole life and had never successfully disproved. She hung up. She sat for another minute with the 3 envelopes on the desk. Then she picked them up, put them in her bag, stood, and went to find Dr. Ferrante, because there were decisions to make, and she wanted to make them properly. The story of what Dr. Marsh did when he found out is not a story of a dramatic confrontation. There was no moment where Hades walked back into his office with the 3 envelopes. Life does not always give you the symmetry that a story seems to promise. What happened was quieter and, in some ways, more complete. Dr. Marsh found out the following morning. He found out because Dr. Ferrante sent him an email at 7:45 a.m. that was 3 paragraphs long and factual in tone, and that contained, in the second paragraph, a description of the previous afternoon's events that was precise enough to be unmistakable. The email noted the external review process that had been conducted 3 months prior. It noted the 4 reviewers' assessments, which Dr. Ferrante attached in full. It noted the 3 offers received, with the institutional affiliations and the level of appointment and the terms as she understood them. It noted that Hades Okonkwo remained a doctoral candidate at Whitmore and that her defense was scheduled and that Dr. Ferrante expected the graduate school's administrative support for that process to be complete and without complication. The email did not accuse. It did not editorialize. It simply placed a set of facts in sequence and let the sequence do its work. Dr. Marsh read the email at 8:03. He read it again. He sat with it for 47 minutes, according to the read receipt Dr. Ferrante had quietly enabled. Then he sent a reply that was 1 paragraph long and that expressed, in language notably more careful than the language he had used in his office the previous morning, his congratulations to Dr. Okonkwo on the response to her presentation and his confidence that the graduate school would provide every support necessary for a successful defense. He did not use the word ambitious. He did not use the word talented. He used the word extraordinary, which was a different word, and which cost him something to write, and which Dr. Ferrante read carefully before forwarding it to Hades without comment, because the forward was the comment. The graduate school's administrative review, which was initiated not by Hades but by Dr. Ferrante, who submitted a formal inquiry about the composition and process of the committee that had reviewed the thesis proposal, found that the review committee had not included Hades as primary advisor, had not sought external input, and had not followed the graduate school's published guidelines for thesis proposal assessment, which required that reviews of complex interdisciplinary projects include at least 1 scholar with expertise in the relevant interdisciplinary methodology. The review found that the process had been irregular. It did not find intent. It found a gap between stated procedure and actual practice that the dean's office was required to address. New guidelines were adopted. The graduate school implemented a revised protocol for thesis proposal reviews that mandated advisor involvement and, for interdisciplinary projects, required at least 1 external review before any administrative guidance about scope was provided to a student. The faculty council voted on the new protocol 6 weeks after Hades' defense. It passed without dissent. Dr. Ferrante was asked to chair the committee that developed the implementation guidelines. She accepted. Dr. Marsh remained as dean. People who make 1 wrong call in a long career generally do, when the institution has the will to correct the process rather than simply remove the person. He did not make the same call again, because the record now existed, and the record made the cost of repeating it visible in a way it had not been before. Adis defended her thesis on a Thursday morning in November. 43 people attended the defense, which was extraordinarily large for a doctoral defense, and which reflected the fact that word about the work had now moved well beyond the circles that Dr. Ferrante had initially shared it with. The committee was 5 members, including Dr. Osei Bonsu, who had agreed to serve as external committee member, which was the proper channel through which his original assessment was now formally part of the record. The defense lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. The committee asked her hard questions, the hardest that could be asked of the work, and she answered them all. There were moments when the discussion moved beyond the thesis itself and into the implications, the policy implications, the methodological implications, the implications for how the field thought about the relationship between formal and informal economic systems. And in those moments, the room became something different from a defense committee, became a group of scholars engaging seriously with ideas that were worth engaging with. At the end, the committee voted. The vote was unanimous. Dr. Claudia Ferrante, who was not given to theatrical gestures, shook Ades's hand and said, "Dr. Okonkwo," and then did not say anything else, because nothing else was required. Ades accepted the Princeton offer. She spent a week on each of the 3 campuses before deciding, and she decided on Princeton because of Professor Diallo, whose intellectual partnership she had sensed in the single conversation after the presentation and who she believed would be the right colleague for the next stage of the work. She told Columbia and Chicago with the graciousness that serious institutions deserved when they had done a serious thing, and both responded in kind. She joined the Princeton faculty the following September. She was 29 years old. She was the youngest holder of an endowed chair in the department's history. She was also, within the first semester, the most sought-after advisor in the program, because doctoral students had read her thesis and recognized in it the thing that doctoral students are always looking for: work that showed them what it was possible to do. She published the thesis as a book 18 months after joining the faculty. The book was titled the same as the thesis. It was reviewed in 4 major academic journals and 2 general interest publications. The reviews used words like landmark and foundational and indispensable. One reviewer said it changed the frame. It was reviewed, also, in a brief note in the alumni newsletter of Whitmore University's graduate school, which listed it under the heading of Notable Alumni Publications. The note was 3 sentences long. It described Ades as a distinguished Whitmore graduate and noted her appointment at Princeton. It did not mention Dr. Marsh. It did not mention the meeting in his office. It did not mention the word ambitious. Some things write themselves out of the record by becoming irrelevant to it. The research center Ades built at Princeton, the Center for Informal Economic Architecture, was formally endowed 2 years after her arrival, through a gift from a foundation whose board had read the book and understood what the work was for. The center funded doctoral students and field researchers across 12 countries. It hosted an annual convening that drew scholars from 6 continents. It produced policy briefs that were used by 3 finance ministries and 1 international development organization. Her father came to the center's inaugural convening. He sat in the front row of the opening session, a 71-year-old economist from Lagos who had spent his career studying exactly the systems his daughter had now put on the international map, and he watched her open the proceedings with the same expression that Ngozi Okonkwo described, later, on the phone with a friend, as the expression of a man who had asked his daughter at dinner every week for 23 years what she had been thinking about and had finally seen the full answer. He did not cry at the convening, because he was Emeka Okonkwo and he had rules about this. He cried on the flight home, quietly, in the window seat, which the woman next to him pretended not to notice, and which he pretended not to notice her pretending, which is the social contract that airplane windows exist to facilitate. There is a photograph from the day of Ades's thesis defense. Dr. Ferrante took it, on her phone, in the corridor, outside the defense room, about 30 seconds after the committee vote was announced. In the photograph, Ades is standing with her back to the tall windows that look east over the campus. The October light is coming through the glass behind her. She is wearing the dark blazer she had worn to Dr. Marsh's office that morning. Her hands are at her sides and she is not quite smiling. She is in the moment just before the smile. The moment where something true has just been confirmed and the feeling of it has not yet organized itself into an expression. Dr. Ferrante kept the photograph on her office wall for the remaining 8 years of her career at Whitmore. When she retired and cleared out her office, she took it down carefully and wrapped it in paper and put it in the box of things that were going home. Not because she needed it to remember, but because it was the truest picture she had of what she had been doing for 31 years, and she was not leaving it in a room that would belong to someone else. Before you close this out, I want to say something to you directly, because this story deserves it. This is fiction. Adais Okonkwo, Dr. Marsh, Dr. Ferrante, the three offers, Fort Princeton, the center. These are characters and institutions built to carry a story. But the thing at the center of the story is not fiction. There is a documented pattern in academic institutions, studied by the scholars who work inside those very institutions, of doctoral students from underrepresented backgrounds receiving administrative guidance that narrows or redirects their most ambitious work, often without the guidance being grounded in the actual quality of the work, and often at a stage where the student has no external validation yet to push back against it. That pattern is real. The students it affects are real. The work that does not get done because of it, the frameworks not built, the data not collected, the questions not asked, that cost is real, even if it is invisible, because you cannot see the research that was never allowed to happen. What Dr. Ferrante did sharing the work externally, building a record, ensuring that the judgment of the work was not left to a single administrative process that was not a dramatic act. It was a careful one. It was the act of someone who understood that institutions are only as fair as the people inside them who are willing to be specific about what fairness requires. And what Adais did walking out of that office without surrendering the work, showing up to the presentation, answering every hard question that was also not dramatic. It was the act of someone who had been taught, from the time she was 6 years old, that the work was serious, and that seriousness was its own kind of protection. So, here is my question for you. If you had been in that room at Whitmore, if you had been one of the 30-odd faculty members who heard that thesis defense and knew, during it, that something significant was happening, and you found out afterward about the meeting that morning in the dean's office, what would you have done with that knowledge? Would you have let it pass? Would you have said something? Would you have been the person who made sure it was on the record? That question matters. Not just in academic institutions. In every room where someone has the power to name what is and isn't possible for another person, and uses that power before they've looked carefully at the evidence. We are all in those rooms at some point, on one side of the desk or the other. Drop your answer in the comments. I want to read every one. Share this story. If it stayed with you, there is someone in your network who needs to hear it. Like this video, subscribe if you're new here, and we will see you next time.